Good morning and good afternoon to those of you that have joined us from overseas. Thank you for joining us today. We have got a full-on 30 minutes of discussion, and we're going to be talking about global mobility and cross-border payments. Easy for me to say. I've only had 2 coffees, maybe I need a third. But before we start, let me just introduce you to Tom. So Tom, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone? I'm sure there's a lot of people on this that know who you are.
Yeah. Hi all, thank you very much, Mel. Thank you very much for hosting us. And Doug, great to be on the panel with yourself. But my name's Tom Cook, Head of Sales at eBay Mass Payments. So short and sweet, we've got about 40 offices globally. We specialise in the final mile of the payroll process. So a global payments organisation delivering payments to employees, statutory bodies, tax parties and third parties globally, and work with payroll providers, aggregators, accounting firms and in-house payroll teams to make sure that people get paid on time, in full, every time. Thanks.
And that's an important part, getting people paid.
Absolutely.
Doug, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks, Mel, and hi, Tom, and nice to be here. And I presume probably fewer people know me, but so I'm Doug. I'm a partner at AAB in our global employment tax and payroll business. Shorter and sweeter, essentially what we do is advise businesses on how to move their people around the world compliantly, efficiently, covering things like tax, social security, and obviously then getting them paid with the assistance of businesses like eBay from time to time. We also cover things like immigration advice, etc., because it can be pretty complex, as we'll get into. But that's kind of us in a nutshell.
So there are a few of you that have joined us this morning. I like to see where you're from and how far. So let's start off with you then, Doug. What trends are you seeing in the global? Well, can I talk today? Hopefully, 30 minutes. What trends are you seeing in global mobility right now, and how are they changing the way that organisations are thinking about payroll and payments?
Yeah, so I mean, it probably comes as a surprise to no one that, and we mention this in sort of every conversation like this, that COVID did change the landscape quite a bit, but it actually happened before then. It started to happen before then. Any of us who've been in the sort of global mobility payments world for a long time have seen a trend from structured longer-term assignments, where typically people went from country A to country B for 2-3 years, maybe even longer, with quite a lot of planning running up to that, to a much less structured, I should say, shorter terms, to have work from anywhere policies, hybrid work, call it what you will. Essentially, what that means is it has brought a lot more businesses into the realm of global mobility without them necessarily even knowing it. So with my background, I used to work at PwC. We support some of the biggest businesses on the planet with their structured mobility programs. And that would have a big in-house team with a lot of manpower behind it, a big vendor network, probably at the time cutting edge technology, and a lot of forward planning. Whereas now it's more, the world is more global, traveling around is a lot easier, technology is a lot better. People take short-term trips from country A to country B and don't necessarily think about it. That brings with it a huge amount of risk. We'll probably talk about risk quite a lot without wanting to get too kind of scaremongering. But it also means that a lot of businesses don't necessarily have the internal governance and structure to manage it. So they don't making point throughout the next half an hour, I suspect, because where does mobility actually sit? It may well not sit in a structured department that is set up for that. It possibly sits in HR, it possibly sits with payroll, possibly sits in finance in some respects, or tax departments. And that's the biggest challenge I think that businesses have today, is that the kind of traditional mobility market is probably about this big. The unstructured, untraditional market is huge, it's massive. And that's, I think, a challenge that probably a lot of people will be worried about.
It's a bit like payroll, isn't it? Because payroll isn't just payroll anymore, is it? They touch pensions, obviously global mobility, expats and payments. And, you know, like in our membership group, it's not just about payroll, it's about other aspects and global mobility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I just think about my own career, previously I worked in a very, very structured global mobility team. Now at AAB, what I do is remove that line between traditional tax mobility and payroll, because actually a lot of the times, a lot of businesses are just managing this all as one anyway, because I think there is a lot more understanding in the business community now that international working is way more complicated than people either thought, or the awareness is just there, right? And it's in the news all the time. And I think the education levels are much, much higher. What that does mean is no one can ignore it anymore. So everybody knows that somebody working in a different country probably has something that they have to be doing from a risk and compliance perspective. And I was talking the other day about, I think those days have gone where people think they can pay people in the same way from the same payroll software no matter where they're working. But that just does mean that it becomes a challenge for a lot more people across a wider realm of business as well. And a lot of that ends up sitting with payroll, because how people are paid is one of the bigger issues that people have to deal with when they're working in another country.
Yeah, I know we've got loads of questions, but it's even like during COVID, when you had CEOs of banks announcing that people can work everywhere, wherever they want to. And then I think all the global mobility experts and payments were like, no, it's not as easy as that. And then obviously as the time went on, then people within companies were going, oh, okay, I didn't realise it's actually going to be that hard. And then also the other thing with COVID was finding out that you had employees that were working in different countries without telling their managers or the C-suite, and then that coming out. And I think that still happens, doesn't it? So, but we have so many questions. Right, so Tom, from a payments perspective, how has the rise of getting people physically paid?
It's a really good question, and as Doug mentioned, there's kind of a big shift in the remote borderless work world that we live in now. COVID was a big impact for that, but there's kind of three core complications of getting people paid accurately and on time. I've split it down to three bits because this is what we talk to clients. Huge overload. Companies must suddenly kind of comply with tax, labour laws, dozens of countries simultaneously. So this kind of drastically increases, like Doug's mentioned it already, but AML, KYC risk, and basically traditional banks are hesitant to process these payments. So then that ties into the FX volatility and the cost of making these payments, because you're relying on single currency payment exposes you to kind of high FX margins, because employees are going to be in weird and wonderful wacky locations. So this is really important when you consider the employee could potentially receive less money in their paycheck at the end of the month. So this creates loads of issues, both with the employee, but also the employer. And then the final bit, I think, is the operational kind of friction around payment systems rely on kind of slow, expensive international wires, etc., SWIFT payments, which lead to delays, intermediary fees, huge manual kind of reconciliation headaches for the finance teams, the payroll teams. And it's basically global payroll is now a much more complex, high risk, I would say, treasury problem, but also payroll problem. So it kind of demands more specialized solutions and services. So that's the three core areas I would look to kind of cover with clients before you even, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to stop you, because I think one of the things that people we coming across with our membership is that more and more people are having problems actually with the physical payment side, and they're underestimating the complexities, because maybe I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago there wasn't so many sanctions or so many compliance issues within different countries, and actually maybe people weren't paying as many people abroad. Now is that they're doing the payroll side, they're doing the global GM, I'm going to say GM side, but actually they're then surprised when the employee doesn't actually get physically paid, and they're finding out on the day that person hasn't been paid.
Yeah, and I think it comes up in a question down the line. Compliance is really increased because it's a critical of how businesses operate across the globe. But then if you put payments on top of that, every single payment has to go for kind of international global screening, global sanction lists, watch lists. And the faster you can do that, the more reliable you can do that, the better it is for everyone. But that is the problem with, I would say, your whole capability to do this, especially when people are moving around as quickly as they are. You start changing the payment destination or the payment amount of payment destination, etc., then things will get flagged, and that's where compliance comes in all along.
So we've obviously mentioned compliance quite a lot, and we're only like 10 minutes in. From a tax and social security to local labour laws, how can organisations sort of stay ahead of these moving targets and ever-changing compliance?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tom, it's almost like we know what we're talking about. Tom just sort of teed me up, like, and you've really got to get your experts in place. But it's absolutely true. I think we talk about governance all the time, and that's a sort of buzzword, right? But you really need to have some sort of structure in place, and ultimately you need to know what you don't know, because there's so much out there. If you think about probably 6 to 7, so how do you get someone from country A to country B? There's the basic logistics of that, and we'll probably come onto that a bit in a while. But there's the immigration side, and those laws are constantly changing. So again, most of us who are in Europe will be pretty aware, hopefully, that there's the new entry-exit system for non-EU nationals entering the EU that just came into place a couple of weeks back. What that essentially means is there's a lot more data that countries hold on who's coming in, who's coming out, what we get there. And again, just give a simple example. You look at somewhere like the US, and if you don't know the inner workings of the US, you go, well, the US is a country, so they would have US employment law. If you look at it on the face of it, it's not a million miles away from UK employment law in a lot of ways, but every state is completely different. So which state are you going to? You look at termination laws in California, for example, you have to pay someone out the day they're terminated. You don't have to do that in every other state. How are you going to know that? You're just not. Then you've got the tax laws, then you've got social security, you've got EU posted worker directive for sending people into the EU for potentially even short terms, albeit there are some exemptions. Then you start to look at corporate exposure. So what is that person doing? Are they creating a permanent establishment risk by sending one of your senior? And then just fairly basic things like health and safety. You know where your people are. What happens if there is a war breaks out in country X, and actually do you know you've got some people in that country? So these are all things that you need to consider, and that's absent the payment side of it when somebody's going from one country to the next. So you can't be expected to know that. So what do you need? You need some trusted advisors, and I think it's become so complicated. If we've gone back 10, 15, 20 years, you probably have a few organizations that could cover everything. And if you just have one advisor, that's just not feasible anymore. So what you're finding is a lot of smaller advisors who are experts in a particular field, working together to create a sort of broader range of services that can otherwise be provided. And as someone working within a business, managing that for an employee population, you just need to have that vendor network set up in the right way. You need to know who you can call on for all of these individual things, because it's hugely complicated. It can go very, very wrong pretty quickly.
And that's like a really interesting point, isn't it? Because, you know, like the geopolitical environment at the moment, you know, we're in quite a volatile world at the moment, and you've got to be organised. You've got to know what's going on, and you're right, you do need to have those specialists, don't you? And I think again that's something that we called upon with Ebury when Ukraine and Russia happens. Actually, how do you pay people in Russia? Well, you can't. You know, if you're based in the UK because of sanctions, and it's just having that understanding. So it really is important to have those specialists on hand to call them.
Absolutely. And sorry to jump back in, but just really quickly on that point, because you raise a really, really great example of something that just happened outside of anybody's control. You suddenly, a lot of businesses who operated in Russia or employed Russian nationals had to deal with them or in Ukraine leaving and going somewhere else. And international laws weren't suspended because of that. So all of us will know. I mean, there's some live in my village that came from Ukraine, drove across the world to suddenly pitch up, but they were employees of certain businesses, and some of those are allowed to work remotely. So was the right immigration in place? Couldn't they're fleeing a war-torn country, but it's still all relevant because it still all catches up down the line. So again, it was that quick response of a business being able to call on an expert is hugely important.
Yeah. And talking about regions then, are there any particular regions or countries that are proving challenging for cross-border payments right now, or on that side? Tom?
I imagine that's aimed at me, but this is like a forever moving beast, because obviously we're in a fast-moving climate, the world is changing. There's kind of there's three areas that make it challenging for the cross-border payments market. So you've got your FX across South America, so where the central bank strictly limits how much foreign currency leaves the country. So there's an added level of documentation that will cause major payment delays, or you need to put all these things in place to get money into that country and get money out. There's the exotic currencies, so these are the smaller currencies that are rarely traded. So this means like FX margin is potentially wider, so it's costing the business more money. The settlement will definitely be slower, which obviously increase risks, and you need to build and factor all of this in when you're paying your staff to make sure they get their money on time. And then there's the compliance countries. So places like Mexico, Brazil, India have unique kind of rules for making payments, and that could be statutory payments for taxes, for pensions. So the payment file format will be unique, and you need to make sure that is correct and coded correctly. If they do happen, this leads to huge and large penalties and real compliance headaches. So I basically mean the core problem is local rules. There's the lack of liquidity potentially, and you basically go back to, you need a specialized country by country solution if and when it happens, because ultimately we're talking about things if and when they happen. You need to be prepared for that, and the answer is make sure you don't try and do it on your own. Go and speak to the experts, because they'll be dealing with it with their other clients. They'll have a solution in place. So that's my advice on that.
Yeah, and it really is important, isn't it? Because the employee experience is like a key topic at the moment. And if there's been a survey that if an employee is paid incorrectly twice, then they will start looking for another job. And also that's trust in your employer, isn't it? So if you're not physically getting the payment, your payroll, your salary on the day you expect, to really understand why it's happened, and the cost in finding the employees is hard at the moment. It's expensive to get new employees, so it is a really important subject. So on mobility policies that are becoming more flexible, hybrid assignments, commuter roles and digital nomads are on the rise. How can payroll adapt to this new reality, Doug?
Yeah, it's really challenging, because like I said, we go back in time and you had sort of 2 or 3 policies if you had a structured mobility program, and you just fit people into those, and that would be fairly straightforward, and away you go. I think that the advice I give is you've got to be upskilled these days, as I think we've been looking at payroll as being much more of a strategic part of a business than just ultimately what's been in the past. And mobility is exactly the same. Global mobility functions have been seen as a cost to a business historically. It's a cost of getting someone from country A to country B. Now it's much more strategic. So you have to look at what do you need to know, but also in terms of policy provision, well, what are you doing it for? What's the purpose? So there will be a few different ways you can look at this. One would be that you've got a specific individual who's got a certain skill set, a unique set of skills, comes with the Liam Neeson quote, and you need that person to be in a specific place to do a specific thing, right? So that policy is going to be very different, because you need to do everything to keep that individual happy. So typically those are the ones that will be on expensive tax equalization policies where they will receive the same amount of money as they would have done had they stayed in their home country. Everything is taken care of, logistics, you move in, you get them a nice house wherever they want it, you move their family, their pets, you put them in expensive private schools, right through to you might have, you do it as part of a developmental process for education and upskilling of your employees. So again, it's been proven that people who have assignments overseas are much more likely to make it into the upper echelon of employment. They just have a broader experience, but you still have to make sure, even if you're doing it for their benefit, which ultimately benefits, and most important, and I think this has fallen away a little bit because the volume of travel has increased so much, is that training and customer experience for that employee. So what do they expect? What's going to happen when they move? What are they expected to do? What's going to be taken care of? So we'd like to see things like tax briefings happen and an explanation of a timeline and when are you going to get paid? How are you going to get paid? Is it going to remain the same? You're going to be paid in the local currency. What does that mean? Where's the risk for you? Cultural awareness training, things like that. Even really basic logistics. That's sort of fallen away in recent history, but I think it's something that needs to come back, because in the same way as you mentioned, people getting paid incorrectly causes them to look for another job. A positive international assignment experience will keep people in a job, but a negative assignment experience, they just won't come back. So you look at the drop-off of individuals who go, have a poor experience because of some of the things that you think are pretty basic while they're away, and they move and they do something else. So I think it's something that people really need to be aware of, really focused on. And like I said before, nowadays a lot of that falls on various different departments and absolutely could include payroll. So upskilling and education of a payroll department is absolutely key. And like I said before, spot what you don't know what you don't know, and make sure you then
and actually that's a really important comment, isn't it? You know, get to know what you don't know. You know, be aware. We were talking, I think, earlier on this week or last week about I was with somebody who works in payroll, and their colleague had lost their passport in another country, and he got called because he couldn't get hold of anybody to say, what do I do? And I mean, it's payroll and HR, and then he had to step in and help out. So it's like, what do you know, and what do you need to do? So to work closer together, do you, or what's your thoughts on that, Doug?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an obvious one, really, when you think about it, that absolutely they should. And I think if we look at this from a slightly more strategic perspective, so if we think about, and obviously there'll be obvious questions about technology and how to use mobility, and payroll used to be a kind of, it happens as something is happening. Now we're looking at, well, can you do something way ahead of time? So before you even look at who an individual is that's moving, so that would usually be an internal business decision. They say, right, mobility team, payroll team, whoever, we're moving this person from here to here to sort it out. Now I'm saying use it as a strategic function. So, and I'm going to give an example, always use this example. We work a lot with energy sector clients, so offshore exploration, oil and gas, wind farms, etc. And this is where it gets quite complicated, because you have domestic tax rules, and you have international tax rules, treaties, etc. If you send someone from the UK, you have a 30-day exemption from a tax perspective. So up to 30 days, no tax in Norway, effectively everything stays the same. If you send someone from the US to Norway, it's 60 days. So for the price of getting someone from the US to Norway versus UK, you can have that person there twice as long, which is way more efficient for the business. You don't have to worry so much about rotation. And yet most people, most businesses would send someone from the UK. Why? Because it's close. So it's easier. Don't think about it from a cost and tax perspective. Similarly speaking, if you send someone from a low tax location to a high tax, there's a delta. That person's either going to be worse off, or the business has got to front up. You send someone from high tax to low tax, probably no difference whatsoever, other than the cost of doing the compliance and the immigration, etc. If you can get ahead of that, you can start to model these things out. And why that's really interesting for payroll is because payroll has 90% of the data that would allow you to run those models in the first place. All you need to do is overlay some tax rules which again is something that we look at quite often, but you have real-time pay information, who that person is, where they are, etc. So you can model that out pretty easily. So then you can make a strategic decision. If it doesn't have to be Tom going to Norway, you can say, well, it could be a pool of people. And we can run all the numbers and say, well, actually, this pool of people is going to cost the business less. So it's far more in advance strategic, but that requires everybody to be working together, because you need all of your tax, HR, payroll, finance, etc., HR, talent management to be working together to figure out what that looks like.
So you mentioned tech, obviously technology and AI and everything else that's coming in. Tom, how important is the tech for the physical payment side for your side?
I would say it's really, really important, because ultimately the technology that we have access to now is completely different to what we had 10 years ago when I started. But the role in global payment, it's all to do with the automation of the complex task, and to manage, we've said risk a million times already, but is to manage the risk. So the technology that we are using and we have access to now really simplifies the tasks for the people, because there's a lot of automation, or payment engines, so payment files and reconciliation data with client systems. So whether that's their ERP or payroll system, it replaces the need to have manual file uploads or manual data entry. You've got the intelligent routing for payments. So payments are automatically routing through the fastest, cheapest local rails. And that kind of takes away the slowness, the expensiveness, and really reduces kind of the fee-heavy Swift wire processes that were in place. Then you've got the automation part, so the reconciliation, so we can instantly match payments with ledgers, eliminating the time-consuming kind of reconciliation headaches that finance teams have. I talked about it already, but the instant screening technology now, so you can continuously screen every payment against global sanction lists, watch lists, and this is a much more fast and more reliable than manually checking. When I first started, this was a process. That's obviously been removed now. You've got prepayment validation, so beneficiaries, payment formats, the validation of the specific currency or country that you're making a payment to is all checked beforehand. So this reduces kind of failed payments and also associated kind of compliance risks. And then the final one, I think, is data security. So it enables the use of kind of segregated client money accounts and creates kind of audit trails for all transactions, ensuring that you've got full regulatory coverage from start to finish of that payment trail. And ultimately, that's really important for audit and everything else attached to making payments globally for all these organisations.
So a few years ago, we ran a survey, and 81% of payroll leaders were still using Excel. How do you feel about that, Doug? Do you think it's changed, and how important is tech on your side?
I mean, it's changed, but probably not as quickly as you might expect, and probably not as quickly as those people surveyed would want it to change, to be honest with you, because again, it's not a place to be able to implement all of these changes and to automate as much. I mean, when Tom talked about integrations, then we do this on an almost daily basis in some way, shape or form. I think there's barely a business that we can integrate 100% with in terms of APIs. There's always something that's got to be done on a spreadsheet or a manual upload. And I think that would be the key takeaway for a lot of people is, where is the business now? Where is it going to be? What does that roadmap look like? What can you do in the meantime to get to a point of being comfortable? Because we talk about tech from a business perspective, but governments are getting way more savvy with this as well. So again, we talked about EES earlier. That just gives governments more data. The link between immigration and tax is loads of horror stories, especially in mainland Europe, of businesses getting shut down. We had one in my previous employment, which was a business that built data centers for the likes of some of the biggest tech companies in the world. They shut down the site. That was thousands of employees because they didn't have social security certificates. So they were technically all exempt from paying social security. They didn't have the certificates. The government went in and shut it down. So they knew they were there, and they suspected they didn't have the right things in place. So it's not to scaremonger, but it's just to say businesses that don't adapt quick enough to adopt technology, somebody's going to do it quicker than you. And that may well be a government, and they may well ask some difficult questions. Who they're likely to ask first is probably the most senior people in the business.
Yeah. So we're coming to an end. Just a short answer, really, if you can. What do you think 2026 is going to look like? Tom?
So I think I would say the challenges to high street banks, it's all to do with visibility, communication, and I would say real-time payments. So it's continuing to be kind of rolled out globally. But if you think about the UK, for example, a few years ago, faster payments were just a word or a term, weren't really in the world we lived in. Now you try and make a payment to someone, you want their money in your account instantly, and you want to pay the person instantly. Historically in payroll, it was fax, and that was a great system, a great solution. But I see that scale. I think the more and more people go traveling, the more and more people have a global mobility contract to work overseas, they want access to these instant payment rails. So I think real-time payouts is going to be a big demand and will really, really kind of grow. Whether it's in 2026 and people want to be paid in seconds, every country globally, it won't happen in every country, but I just think that will grow really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's what I can see on a payments perspective. And then at the moment, you try and do every payment in the world. You can pay salaries to a lot of countries, but where it gets complex is tax and statutory bodies. So some kind of standardization around tax payments on a global scale. I think there needs to be a real movement in that as well.
And Doug, a final word from you. What do you think 26 is going to look like?
Yeah, again, I don't know if it'll be 26, but the trend is, I just talked about then, governments having more information, right? So pretty much every government is short of cash. Every government now has more information at their fingertips. It's a matter of time, and it's already started in some locations. We're just going to start asking more questions. So everything is way more visible. So every business on the planet is way more visible than it ever used to be, because everybody's promoting themselves. Everybody's on social media. Everyone's on LinkedIn. Everybody says we can travel around the world. We can do this. We're getting funding. We're getting whatever. Governments can see that, and they know there's untaxed money there in the billions, because if you think about the US as a country, Donald Trump has slapped tariffs on everybody he can slap tariffs on. He's trying to make everybody who's not doing that. It's a matter of time before it starts going, we've got a load of immigration data. Let's start asking some difficult questions about these big multinationals who probably aren't paying as much tax as we should be. And that's going to start with some senior execs who travel in and out of the country quite regularly. And to be honest with you, this information's been there for years. If you have someone's passport number, you can go on the Department of Homeland Security website, type it in, and it'll tell you all their ins and outs from the US. I could do that now if I had one of your passport numbers. So the public can do it. It tells you that the government can do it. And I think you'll see that trend, and you'll start to get asked that question. All of us have traveled to the US in the past. You'll probably start to get asked that question a bit more at borders. The reason for that is going to be tax. I think people just need to be a bit more aware that this is coming. And when it does, it won't be a softly approach. It'll be a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and as you say, you know, I mean, you look at the UK and what we've got coming up in November potentially. Every government needs money at the moment. But I just want to say thank you so much. We've had some positive comments. Nobody commented where they were from, so I'm really disappointed on that side. But thank you. Hopefully. Tom did, yeah. Thank you, Tom. Tom's in Dubai, so lucky you. But hopefully by the end of today, I can say global mobility. I never thought we'd run a LinkedIn live and say Liam Neeson, which has been one of my favourite comments ever. I'm going to have to try and get more quotes from him and add them in further LinkedIn lives. But anyway, but thank you so much, Doug, for sharing your information, and also Tom. If people want to contact you after today, are you happy for them to contact you directly through LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fab. Okay, if you have just joined us towards the end of this LinkedIn Live, it is saved on my profile. It'll also be on the GPA website, so you can view the whole of today's session. But thanks again for everyone that's joined us, and thank you, Doug and Tom. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.